Sometimes violence is the only path towards justice. This is what Hitler wrote about in his book Mein Kampf in 1925, foreshadowing his later actions in the Holocaust. Let that sink in for a moment. How evil, how dangerous. Now, what if I told you that Hitler didn't actually say that? That the man who uttered those very words was none other than Nelson Mandela, a man who we all revere and respect when he was fighting apartheid in South Africa in the 1980s. Does that change the way you perceive this quote? Why? Why does it matter who says something? Why does that affect the way that we perceive information? Ideas should be evaluated by their truth, their logic, and their merit. Yet, too often, this is not the case. In our world here today, it is more important to be liked than it is to be right. It is more persuasive to be charismatic than it is to be correct. We live in a world where it is easier to convince somebody with a positive perception of you of a falsehood than it is to convince somebody with a negative perception of you of a truth. Ladies and gentlemen, over the next 7 minutes, I want to explore how who says something and how they present it can radically alter how it is received. And more importantly, how you can apply this to your life, how you can convince and persuade others while also protecting yourself from manipulation. Now, let me take a couple of steps back and tell you about how I first got hooked by this topic. But before I do that, I'll give you some context about the American military. US military recruitment has been falling for the last 40 years. It's dropped 35% since 2013. Let me also tell you that the American military and Navy have banned all their military personnel from having TikTok on their phones since 2020. Keep that in mind. Let's get back to my story. It all started with TikTok 2 years ago. Picture this. It's April of 2023, and a slightly younger version of me, a couple less wrinkles, slightly fewer gray hairs, is laying there in my bed, and I'm scrolling on TikTok as one does. And suddenly I notice something strange. My For You page has been bombarded by a barrage of military edits. Some of you in the audience might know what I'm talking about. An assortment of videos romanticizing life in the American military. First-person shots of camaraderie, adrenaline, roaring jets, and desert sun. These were all characterized by the same haunting lyrics. If you're lonely, you know I'm here waiting for you. From Franz Ferdinand's 2004 song, Take Me Out. Now, these videos weren't posted by the American military's, the US Army's TikTok account. They seem to come from real, authentic individuals, real American soldiers serving their country, documenting their experiences. These were people from my country, people I could relate to, people from my tribe. Now, why was this relevant? Because the fact of the matter was that we live in a world where tribalism defines everything. It does. But I had to ask myself one question, and that question was this. Was it truly a coincidence that these videos started exploding in popularity at the exact same time when military recruitment had dropped to its lowest levels in decades? Now, I must confess, these edits were good. These edits were so good, in fact, they had made me seriously question my life. They'd made me contemplate ditching my plans of going to college and enlisting in the military instead. Let me say that again. A couple of TikToks made me question my entire life. But I'm not here to tell you that these TikToks were a part of some larger attempt by the American military to boost their recruitment numbers. But for all I know, they very well could be. And if I had known that to be the case, maybe I wouldn't have found these messages so compelling. Maybe I would have perceived them in a different way. Maybe I wouldn't have contemplated enlisting at all. But the fact of the matter is that I did. But why? Why did these videos affect me so much? Because these seemed to come from members of my imagined community, members of my so-called tribe. And in our world today, as I said, tribalism is everything. We increasingly define ourselves not by what we think, not by what we believe, but by which groups, be they cultural, social, or political or otherwise, that we align ourselves with, that we belong to. Now, this is incredibly significant because it means that we are more likely to accept ideas, not because they're true, but simply because they come from members of our so-called tribes, people who we perceive to be on our side. We're more likely to reject those exact same ideas if they come from members of other tribes, people we perceive to be from the other side. Now, this is incredibly dangerous because it creates this narrative of us versus them. And in doing so, if our loyalty to any particular group outweighs our pursuit of truth, we lose the ability to think for ourselves. We no longer believe things because they're true. We believe them because they're convenient to accept. Now, it's not just who says something that influences how we receive messages, but also the way in which it's presented. Let me take you back to 1960. The United States is gearing up for its presidential elections between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And for the first time in history, these presidential debates are going to be broadcast not just by radio, but also on live television. The same debate, the same arguments, the same words, just two different mediums of experiencing them. Now here's where it gets interesting. Depending on how people had experienced this debate, they had radically different perceptions of what exactly had transpired. For everybody who listened to the debate on the radio, overwhelmingly thought that Nixon had won. Why not? He sounded intelligent, articulate, and confident. He had all the facts on his side. But everybody who watched it on television thought that it was Kennedy who had won. Why is that? Well, the answer to that question is a little bit unimpressive. It's because John F. Kennedy here is good-looking and Richard Nixon is not. Revolutionary, I know. But it's true. And what this goes to show is that this was the exact same message. The only thing that was different was the medium. And that is what made all the difference. The Canadian psychologist Marshall McLuhan once theorized that the medium is the message. But in 1960, the medium didn't just carry the message, it actively shaped it, just as it does in each of our lives every single day. Now, how does this apply to you? How can you use this in your life? When you next try to persuade somebody, remember this: the truth alone is not enough. You can have the most logical, fact-checked, morally sound argument in the world, but if your audience doesn't relate to you, if they don't trust you, if they don't feel that you're one of them, your message isn't going to land. The greatest and most persuasive speakers don't just speak the truth. They build trust because they understand that people don't just listen to what you say. They listen to who you are when you say it. That's ethos, the power of your credibility; pathos, the power of your emotional connection; and logos, your logic, which is still relevant. But persuasion is about a little more than just logic. Persuasion is about making your audience feel like you see them, you understand them, you are one of them. Only then will people not just hear, but actually listen to what you have to say. Now, let's flip it. What does this mean for somebody on the receiving end of a message? It means that we're all vulnerable to being swayed, not by truth, but by charisma, not by logic, but by likability, not by substance, but by style. And so, how do we protect ourselves from all of this? The answer to that question is simple. We strip away the noise. When you're next presented with an idea, ask yourself this: would you still agree with it if it was presented by somebody who you don't find admirable? Would you still reject it if it comes from somebody who you do admire? Separate the messenger from the message that they're propagating. This will allow you to truly see the truth and understand why you believe the beliefs that you believe. Now, to conclude, let me say this. We live in a world where perception is reality, where a couple of well-lit TikToks have the capacity to sway your dreams, where who says something and how they say it is often more important than what it is that they actually say. Now, it doesn't always have to be that way. We can train ourselves to think and listen more critically. We can learn to persuade more ethically. We must teach ourselves to judge ideas by their merits, not by what tribe they come from, not by how they make us feel, and certainly not by who is delivering them. Because if you can't think for yourself, somebody else will do it for you. And you'll find yourself defending the indefensible, excusing the inexcusable, justifying the unjustifiable. Ladies and gentlemen, don't shoot the messenger. But if you must shoot, aim for the message. Thank you.